Good morning. Today I'm going to talk about the welfare economics. So, in the last lecture, we discussed about how the Paretian efficiency is going to, achieve based on the Edgewood box diagram and other aspect, in fact. So today I'm again going to continue with that kind of a setting in a much more different aspect which normally we discuss, that is called the welfare economics. So what is welfare economics? It's a branch of economics concerned with discovering the principles of maximizing social welfare. So in a very simple sense, this is how normally people try to define welfare economics. So the issue is that in the welfare premise, people do discussed about various aspects of how we can actually achieve social welfare, and that is the possibility of social welfare maximizations and under what circumstances this can be questioned and etc. So this is in fact roughly comes under the social welfare framework. So normally the heyday of welfare theories are from 1900 to 1955. Why this date is also important? Because during that period most of the contribution has been made, but it doesn't mean that later period it was. That is actually the beginning, and of course many of the theories which normally we teach in the classrooms and textbooks all forms basically in this spirit. So that is why we say that this is the heyday of welfare concept, and now the micro this welfare concept is basically within the framework of the microeconomics scenario, and obviously there are other understanding also. But we know that there are many people who had contributed, in fact, on this aspect, such as Pareto. Then there are people like yes, Pigu. So many people had worked on it. Then Samuelson, Amartya Sen, and so many people. And the social choice theory and all later developed based on the contribution of Kenneth Arrow. Etc. are also the product. Two prominent figures we need to really talk about is Bergson and you know then you also had maybe acquainted with the Sitowski, this paradoxical situation, and Samuelson's rebel preference analysis, etc. So all this is actually comes under the social welfare principles. This is all about this. Many people had contributed, though I am not actually going to the details of all that. What I am actually strictly confined with is the welfare economics per se in microeconomics. All right, so many people had contributed, so I just skipped all of them. Now their contribution, we'll eventually get to know that what are these contributions and all. So there is no separate lecture for that. See, as which is given in this slide, welfare economics has certain principles. All right, we call it as fundamental theorems of welfare economics. So some principles, strong principles. Now, there are two fundamental theorems of welfare economics. Normally, everybody. So let me define that first, and then we'll see that how that is being derived. So that would be the mechanism in which I follow to teach welfare economics. So the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics in a simplest possible way we can define is if all markets are perfectly competitive, the allocation of resources will be Pareto efficient. So we will examine the statement and see that whether this is a coherent theory, and we will move forward then to the second fundamental theorem. That is, any Pareto efficient allocation can be obtained as the outcome of competitive market process, provided that the economy's initial endowment of resources can be distributed via a lump sum tax and a subsidy among agents. So these two theories in fact placed in two different premises altogether. All right. The first fundamental theorem is actually placed in an ideal situation, which is a competitive environment. We don't have no third party play any role in the market and the welfare of anybody who are the players inside the market. In the second case, it is not like that. There is also a sort of a distributive aspect comes in, or the role of third party plays. And if the role of third party and making that effort a welfareistic premise. So that is what is actually these two fundamental theorems talks about. So one is actually an ideal situation. The other one is actually, if the situation is not ideal, then how can we achieve that ideal? So the second one is largely normative one. The first one is a positive analysis in that sense. So these two things should be very clear to the students when we speak about the welfare aspects. So let us come to the first fundamental theorem and see that how and the process in which it been created. So let's do in a conventional way of placing the assumptions. Like we know that the only kind of economic agent is the consumer in this case. And no production is possible. Economic activities consist of trading and consumption of two consumers. I, that is a 1 and 2, are described completely by their preferences or utility function, in that sense, UI. And you also have two commodities, that is K, which is 1 and 2, that they possess. That is initial endowment is W Ki, which is also greater than or equal to 0 for the consumer. So in that sense, consumers' preferences are continuous, strict, convex, and strongly monotone. We know that in the first semester why we need to have all these things has been discussed. Therefore, there is no point of actually going back to continuity, strict convexity, and a strongly monotone case dealing here. So it is already given, and they trade the goods among themselves according to this two certain rules. That is a price taker rule. This is very, very important. Under this, anyway, we haven't actually defined market structure, but it is quite clear that this market structure is a price having a price take a behavior rather than a price make a behavior. That is obviously tells us that though it is two individual, it is not actually talking about a monopoly or a sort of kind a market structure, whereas they are actually the price makers or the one side. But in these two cases, the price is given and the price taking behavior is being largely associated with it. And there is a market for each good in which the price of the good is determined. That is another assumption. And the goal to make themselves better off, each consumer attempted to choose the most preferred bundle that he can afford in that context. So if that is the case, you can simply, these assumptions are logically coherent, and it is also important to make that coherent concepts into notations to make it more convenient and easy to derive certain conclusions. So let us put it in that sense, a notation format, that is you have XKI, consumer I's consumption commodity K, and you have price which is greater than or equal to 0, price vectors is given. Then you have x1 and x, you have an x vector, that is consumer consumption vector is given. Then you have also consumer I's endowment vector, income vector. So, or what you call initial allocation here. Then you have also Wi plus W Wk plus Wk2, K1 plus K2, which is also greater, that is total endowment of K in the economy. So you talk about actually the whole economy, as we have seen in the Edgewood box diagram case. Now, if Z is given, that is XIW I of consumer, X is demand. Now, an allocation in this economy is an assignment of a non-negative consumption vector to each consumer. Therefore, you have X which is equal to X1, X2, which is equal to any vector. In this case, two individuals vector, that is X1 and 1, X1 2, and X2 1 and X2 2. So this is what is actually allocation and the possibility in that sense. So once you have also clear in that, as we have already seen in the general equilibrium case of an Edgewood box diagram, simply you can make a Edgewood box diagram in that context, and all of the information contains in 2%, 2 into two, good pure exchange economy can be represented in a convenient graphical forms of Edgewood box. It has a width of the height of it, and any point in the box represented non-wasteful division of the economy's total endowment between two consumer. That is why we have actually a pure Edgewood box diagram, and it is formed because it is two individuals' perception. We have already seen that in the lecture 3. So an allocation is feasible for the economy if ki plus xk2, which is less than or equal to this W. That is, the fact that it is non-wasteful means that you have x1 2 and x2 2, which is equal to the inverse of x11 and by with respect to w1 and x1 inverse of x 21 by W2. That is, you have an excess demand which is 0. It implies that whatever price endowment you have, you will be spending for it, for either obtaining X1 or obtaining X2. Same the case with the two individual. So you have actually the complete utilization of the endowment which you have. That means if you have suppose 100 rupees, you spend all the 100 rupees. You don't keep any money. So that is also depends on the price of the commodity, and we know that the price ratio and all that also forms your rise of a curve and how goods are allocated among economic agents for each I in that sense. So what you do is actually you maximize your XI with respect to your utility such that your PX, that is price of X1, which is equal to the price which the endowment, price endowment of price endowment you have. That is actually forms an offer curve. For a given endowment, it is the set of demand bundles at every price vector in that sense. Now, if you have all these things defined, then it is easy to make a solution. That is, wealth level is determined by the value of price, where you have a WI capital, the capital W, which is actually the total endowment in that sense, which is actually nothing but the PW I, which is equal to the PWI of that is the total price with respect to the individual case, which is also equal to the price of one commodity with respect to the entitlement and the price of two with respect to the commodity in that sense. So of any vector of the market price P, which is equal to P1 and P2. So what you do, the market price is actually collection of these two prices. That is what it is. And the market demand is actually the commodity, in fact, a collection of the commodity, which is also related with the price itself in that sense. So budget set is a function of price in that context. That is, you have a BIP, which is equal to PXI, which is less than or equal to PWI. That is, your price of the commodity, the price which you are ready to pay is also going to be less than or equal to the endowment which you have. Why it is not more than? Because you don't actually talk about a credit economy here. Whatever money you have, you will spend. Because there is no other party you can depend on in this model. This is only two individual case, and whatever money you have to spend in that context. So it is quite clear and pretty standard. So each consumer take these prices as given and choose the most preferred bundle from his consumption set in that sense. So once you have all these things, it is quite clear that you have a competitive walrus in equilibrium in place. So what is a competitive walrus in case? In that sense, it's very clear that is competitive walrus in equilibrium for an Edgewood box diagram is a pair of P star X star. It is nothing but the optimal price which you offer and the optimal quantity which you get out of it. So that it is a summation of all the optimal prices given your entitlement, which is less than or equal to the total endowment which you have inside to be inside the market. So P star is a competitive equilibrium if there is no good for which there is a positive excess demand in that context. So sigma ZP is therefore less than or equal to 0. It implies that the competitive price is actually competitive itself. So if one consumer wish to be a net demander of some good, the other must be net supplier of the good in exactly the same amount in that sense. So demand should equally supply if all goods are desirable in that context. So it is a little bit elaboration is required, though it is pretty standard. But anyway, for the beginners, I need to tell you something, that is, see, if you have some commodity, if you have some entitlement, you are in the market, and the other person is also have some entitlement, then they are also in the market. Then the price of the commodity and the exchange of the commodities depending on your endowment, and you come in the market, you exchange it, and you, based on your entitlement, you will be optimally spending for the commodity, and then you will get a share. So that share is actually being treated as the optimal share, and that is what is called the optimal share at a P star price. So you have W P star therefore, and if it is for the first individual, then it's known as 1, the other one is 2. So this summation of that is actually gives the market demand. Now, if it is optimally distributed, then what is actually there in the market can be shared between two individuals. So therefore, there is a possible tangentiation in that sense. So if that is the case, then you will achieve an equilibrium, which is we have already discussed in the second and third lectures, largely in the third lecture. So let me move to the Waller's equilibrium and more aspect of it. So at equilibrium in the Edgewood box, the offer curve of two agent intersects. At each an intersection, the demand bundles of each agent are compatible with the available supply. So we will come to the graph in a while. So if a P star, which is equal to P1, or we have already given that star. The graph in the fifth graph, which if you look into the third lecture, you probably had encountered that. So if P star is equal to P1 star, P2 star is a competitive price vector, then so is an alpha P star, which is equal to alpha P1 star with respect to alpha P2 star. So for any alpha which is greater than 0, so any amount which basically any commodity you will be paying for it. So only relative price P1 star by P2 star are determined in an equilibrium. Therefore, to determine equilibrium price, we need only to determine price at which one of the market clears. The other market will necessarily clear at the same price. So in that sense, so this is what is actually the beauty of this Waller's case. Earlier in the partial equilibrium model, we only talk about one market, one side of the market getting clear, but other market we don't speak. But in this case, it is actually, if it is there in the Edgewood box case, as I said in the beginning, so if one person is actually taken some portion of the commodity with the entitlement, the other person will take the remaining one in that sense. So logically, if it is a closed model, then naturally they will be having the 100% entitlement. Through that way, it is exhaust the market, and you can say that actually the market is an efficient exchange or Pareto case. So it may happen that a pure exchange economy does not have any Waller's equilibrium if one of the consumer preferences are not strongly monotone and entitlement lies in the boundaries of the Edgewood box diagram. Now, this is what is actually one of the problems. If one person is actually talks about the boundary thing, there is a corner solution. The other person is not having actually the market for that particular commodity, because do I have money, but I'm not actually getting that. Say in that context, it is simple to say that see X and Y is there, but the complete X is being actually bought by the other person. But now it is left for me only Y. So I have no two commodity market available, because I no longer have the option of going for this X. Why? Because the X is being actually completely exhausted by the person. That sense. So this is a problem. So that should not be the case. So corner solution is actually a kind of extreme situation there. But it not says that it is not going to happen. But if that is the case, then it violates that I have an option of buying two commodity. So in order to avoid that, that is what your indifference curve never touches in that sense. of your parallel, two axes. Why? Because if that is the case, then there is a possibility of a corner solution, and it will actually deny the other person getting an option of being inside the market with options, the choice theoretic framework. So, to avoid that, this is actually need to be strictly said that, you should have this strong monotone density. And the other case is non-convex in that case also. All right, we have all that we have seen in the the third lecture. That is, there you can see that that crisscrossing points. That is actually something very important. So I don't want to go back to the lecture. So which will be actually an repetition. So if that is given, then it is quite clear that the Pareto optimal, that is the efficient allocation, is a reality. That is an allocation where there is no alternative feasible outcome at which every individual in the economy has at least as well of, and some individual is strictly better off. So if that is the case, no matter the market type, then there is an improvement. So some person is getting improvement. So if you say that some person is actually getting an improvement, says that the other distribution is not efficient. That is what is normally we see, because some room reallocation gives some room to even get this distribution a better distribution. So the t-1 distribution is actually inefficient when you compare that with t+1 case. So this is what is or the t case. So at any competitive allocation, there is no alternative feasible allocation that can benefit one consumer without hurting the other. So this is what is actually called this optimality condition. So once you reach the optimality, then it is difficult basically to alter the situation and make anyone better off. Or that is what is actually says it's first best. Now lies at the contract curve portion of the Pareto and the first fundamental. Therefore, you will simply at the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics in the Edgewood box. That is competitive allocation yield Pareto optimal. Now, once you have a competitive equilibrium scenario, then definitely you will be ending up with a Pareto efficient allocation. This is what is actually the kind of situation in our first fundamental theorem of welfare economics being deducted. And any perfectly competitive, in a nutshell, you can say that any perfectly competitive in equilibrium is perfectly the Pareto efficient. That is, deviation from perfectly competitive equilibrium necessarily makes someone worse off. So now you can say that categorically, that is, if you are in a competitive environment, then no matter what is the distribution, it would be efficient. Okay, that means the whether the person is having 1% or 10% or 50%, same. Doesn't matter. Efficient from the perspective of Pareto efficiency, it is exhausted. That is what is called the efficiency in that sense. So implication of the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics from that particular point follows that perfectly competitive market need no guidance. All important information in the market is aggregated in and signaled to participant through prices. Now, basis of the economist's faith in market prices as an allocation mechanism, decentralized versus centralized decision is also a very, very important one as far as this particular theoretical concerns are concerned. Okay, now one would also has to keep in mind that the conditions defining Pareto efficiency, that is the marginal substitution of one person with respect to the other, and the marginal technical substitution of one commodity with that of the other, and the marginal rate of product transformation MRT, which is MRS, which is also going to be one and the same in the Pareto case or the competitive equilibrium context and the Pareto efficiency context. So therefore, the first fundamental theorem as a first fundamental theorem, it is ideal, and of course as a standard argument point, this is actually the baseline in which you set and you see that how far you are distancing from this particular market form. Okay, or you can say that the ideality of welfare in that. So if I aspire to speak about welfare, anybody aspires to speak welfare, we definitely has to put this as baseline. You cannot actually move away or move ahead of this particular first base. Now, if you encounter that your situation is not at all nearer to them, that is actually the distance in which you basically with, or you say that actually how inequality, how unequal or how inefficient is our distribution based on that. All right. So the condition defining competitive equilibrium in that sense also very important. And the price taking consumer chooses SW, and it's that marginal rate of substitution, which is equal to PS by PW. So we have already seen all that in that context. So you have all the slopes and other things which we have already talked about in the Edgewood case of the third lecture. So therefore, it is also try to exhibit that how this has been realized. So I'm leaving that portion without mentioning because it's already been given. So a perfectly competitive equilibrium satisfies all the properties of Pareto efficiency in that. And that is the marginal rate of substitution is equal to the slope over the PPC, and efficiency requires price reflected marginal cost, that is PS by PS, PW, which is equal to MCS by MCW. So MC measures to the cost society of providing a good, and the good should only be provided in those who value it more than it costs society to produce. So what role does this fundamentally leave for government? I think literally nothing, very little of all markets are perfectly competitive. If markets are competitive, then there is no need of a government. Normally, it has always been argued that to make a competitive, in the government has to leave. No, it is that means you see there is a wrong notion that no, we basically we start with a model that there is a competitive environment. Once you have a competitive environment, there is no point of actually having government. Now, if you know that actually the world is not competitive or it is not perfectly competitive, then some element of government will also be there. Now, you can say that unless and until the goals of the government, the goals of the society is welfare, then what you have to do is actually you create an environment in which you can simply negotiate. Now, creating an environment of this thing, you have to actually do away with all kinds of inequalities in that sense. So, how do you do this? Again, it's a question of institutional intervention. So, it is like a circularity which we speak. So, you want to actually make a markets competitive, but if you want to really make a market competitive, you should also have the environment for that. You start with your history. That means you start with an inequality premise. For example, the countries like India. I can't speak much. Of course, I can speak, but I'm not going to attempt on the issues of US or UK. But let me stick upon Indian context or Kerala context particularly. Now, if you start with a social structure which is hierarchical or technically speaking unequal, see, if your market treat, it is actually not the market. If your premise of the market is unequal, then you cannot simply make a market which is play fair games, because that's not possible, because your premise is unequal in that sense. So that is to be more clear. See, if there is a gender discrimination exists in the society, and the market of that particular society will also reflect on it, because you start with an unequal premise in that sense. Or if you have all kinds of caste class divisions that exist in certain market, then that will persist unless and until you have deliberations to remove that kind of a barrier in that sense. So market cannot actually remove this unless you let the market act accordingly, because if your norms place like that, then it is also placed in the minds of the people. So that will create a moral barrier to freely act according to the market logic in that sense. So the role of first fundamental theorem therefore is very important to say that actually we are not talking about an unequal society, and that will be a competitive kind of thing. That is actually the problem which we'll discuss in the second fundamental theorem. The first fundamental theorem is a positive analysis. It says that suppose you have actually a possibility of a perfectly competitive environment, then allocation of resources can be Pareto efficient. There is no doubt on that. So that is actually the subscribing positivity of this theorem, and that will make the theorem as baseline for any analysis of imperfection. All right, because you know that the real world, real societal setup or the market setup which we talk is not this ideal. Now, if it is ideal, then there is no point of actually worry about this imperfect world, because that imperfect world is literally doesn't exist in that sense. So this is actually the kind of situation. So if your market is therefore competitive, it is needless to argue for a government. Otherwise, there is definitely the third party plays a very, very important role. So very little. That is why I said at the beginning that very little of all markets are perfectly competitive. Then the government has to do. So provisions of legal framework for legal society and market is nothing to do if that is the case, if the perfect competition exists. That is why Ronald Coase, in one of his propositions of the law in economics or the new institution economics or whatever, which was so many branches of economics being developed based on the observation of finance. That is Ronald Coase. That is, suppose if you have an environment of negotiating each other, efficiency is the result in that sense. So it doesn't matter which market structure, what kind of entitlement, if you have the environment of negotiation. Now, this environment of negotiation is not hierarchical, by the way. This should be very, very clear. It's non-hierarchical environment in which you can freely engage for negotiation. Then the transaction cost problem will be resolved, or what you call bargaining can overcome the problem of externality. But the perfect competitive environment doesn't have any externality in that context. So if that is the case, then ideally you do have a sort of efficiency, and that efficiency can be definitely the Pareto efficiency, the first best. So this is actually forms the first fundamental theorem of welfare and rationalizes the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics. So the scope for intervention of any other third party in that particular context is limited. Now, if you talk a lot of interventions of the government, the legal system, all constitutional, political, all this in technical, sub-disciplines of economics is in fact environmental economics, all this health economics, everything is in fact talks about the deviation from this particular competitive environment. So it doesn't mean that this is actually irrelevant. Now, once you know this thing, then only you can actually talk about how divergent, how distant you are basically from the environment of welfare. So this is what is actually the relevance in my mind to do with the first fundamental theorem of welfare. So with this, let me actually move to some other aspect which is also pertinently important. That is, in the real world, you do have actually problems regarding the sources of failure of this, or moving away from this reality. That so this market. That is what is the reality is. So what are these market? So when you say that condition, a market situation is non-perfect competitive, then it is clear to the fact that there is all a possibility of a failure, and this failure leads because of this failure causes because of certain elements like imperfections, for example, or poor information. That is, the moment you say that information asymmetry being inflicted, then that itself is the end of the perfect competitive environment, because perfect competitive environment as a default by assumption says that you have you know uh, uh, information which is actually um, um, you have a symmetry of information, okay, perfect knowledge about the market in that sense. But all other imperfect market do talk about actually aberration, or do talk about an imperfection in the information which is available to the buyers as well as to the sellers. See, that is forms in fact the imperfect market, such as the monopolistic competition, oligopoly, duopoly, then monopoly, then you have bilateral monopoly. All kinds of this do work based on these things. And the results in market, what is actually the ultimate result of this? This is in fact create a price which is always greater than margin cost. So this actually violates marginalist principles of MC equals MR, which is equal to P principle. So under any imperfect competitive environment, you definitely have a P which is always greater than MC. Now, in textbooks of different market structure which determines price based on the interaction of MC equals EMA, I think there is a pretty wrong perception inculcated into students, particularly. Because all the imperfect market do have a price which is always greater than MC. Then the MC and MR kind of an interaction which determines quantity, maybe quantity for determining quantity, but be given you an oligopolist or a monopolist, the quantity is completely determined by, or the threshold of quantity may be set based on MC equals MR kind of thing. But we know that under an imperfect world scenario, your MCMR cannot be one and the same. So if your MCMR is actually one and the same, then P is also going to be one and the same. If that is the case, then this proposition of P is greater than MC never hold. All right. Now, the moment you say that P is greater than MC, then that implies that your MC and MR is actually not interacting. That this is not one and the same kind of stuff. It will never touch each other. So if that is the case, then there is always a kind of difference. And there comes actually the relevance of King to demand curve and all in the earlier lecture and also. But I don't want to basically delve into all that duopoly, oligopoly kind of situation. But it is quite clear that once you have a P which is greater than MC, then the MC equals MR is no longer exist, which determines the quantity, that is also no longer exist. Now in the monopoly, this is not going to work. Duopoly, it is not going to work. Then monopolistic competition, again, it is very difficult, but at least maybe the size, the distance between MC and MR may be coming down. That is actually the price which you can charge may come down when you compare that with a P, but it will be always higher than your perfect competition price. So your P, therefore, logically, everybody speaks that your P under perfect competition is always the lowest one, and any other market condition which is having a P which is always greater than that, then that itself says that this is not actually being determined based on your MC. Quite clearly, so leads to an inefficient undersupply, overpricing, etc. So this is what is actually a violation. It creates, it results a violation of your perfect competitive environment. So market failure, we mean that failure of perfect competition, the perfect environment which we spoke about. Now it is always people misunderstand or misconceptualize that this is actually something else. So the market failure, we mean that actually the failure of perfect competition. That means a failure of say Pareto efficient context in that sense. So once you have that in place, then all the it is quite unfortunate that many studies, even the newer and newer studies, is all rely on this principle of even market failure. They do talk about the the ideal situation. But if you use that ideal situation for only a baseline, then it's fine, no problem. That is theoretically coherent. Then it is actually looking the distance between the inefficiency and the efficiency. Then that is in my mind is a better way of looking at it. So I have no problem with it. So if it is other way around, then there is conceptually there is a lot of issues, and that misconception often being carried in the classrooms also. So the missing market is the second problem. That is, for some goods no market exists at all, such as the public good, where, see, again, interesting thing is that you have a market, that is, you have demand. Market in the sense you only one side of the market. You have actually the market demand for the commodity, but nobody is ready to pay the appropriate price for it, because it is given that it is not a privately internalizing commodity, and the benefit can actually spill over to the other person also. So the reservation price of this particular, or the price for this particular commodity by one X or A would be always less than what is his or her expected benefit in that sense. So what is in reality here, you underprice the commodity, and because of the underpricing the commodity get never been realized. So once you have the provision of public good, then it will not actually take place. So defense, clean air, information, inability to exclude other means goods not provided, risky goods, credit insurance, adverse selection, moral hazard problem, everything comes under this category. And the final point is actually the externality. I've already discussed what is externality and how we overcome as Gaussian framework, bargaining can overcome the problem of externality. But that is only in the first case, as a perfect competitive environment exists. But if other than that, then there would be some sort of an effort which will make us to move towards first fundamental theorem of welfare. Where comes the importance of the second fundamental theorem of welfare, which I'll discuss in the next lecture. But before that, let me wrap it. That is, what is externality in that sense. So one agent produces goods that affect another agent, even though they do not trade the good in market. So a negative pollution, congestion, positive basic research networks, etc. effect based on that. And spray example is many. Some people spray, that is perfumes, create a kind of positive spillover. At the same time, they are, for others, maybe somebody who's asthmatic may have trouble if you have a very strong odor, if you walk with a strong odor, and also so this is actually the kind of positive and negative extent. So you inflict a cost or benefit to the other person, and you can say that actually you're not completely internalizing the effect which you're supposed to get. Then that kind of an effect is called an external effect, or you call the externality. And marginal private cost and marginal social cost is actually diverges in that context. So if a good Y imposes a negative externality on other agent, then MC social benefit is actually greater than the marginal cost of the private individual. So this is again a problem where you have a competitive equilibrium where this never happens. That is, your Px by Py is equal to Mcx by Mcy, which is the private, as well as the, but in the Pareto efficient case also this is the case, but otherwise this is not actually going to happen. That is, your Px by Py, which is not going to be equal to Mcx by Mcy in that context. So private market decisions don't maximize social welfare in that context. So these are actually kind of situation in which we run into, and we already seen that what is actually the benefit as well as the problem to look into the aspects of first fundamental theorem. With this, let me conclude, and thank you for listening and watching the lecture. Thank you so much.